Today's May 29th, 2020, and if you're receiving this recording, it's because you are somebody who is important to me, and I feel utterly compelled at this moment in time to share the information that I know and that I can offer as perspective to current events happening in the world right now. Especially at this moment where there is so much information and the truth is layered. Some of this I have known and have been researching for the last several years, and some of it has just come into my awareness recently as I've dug in deeper. And it just feels urgent to me right now, at the very least, to let the people that are close to me, my family, my chosen family, those with whom I have a heart connection, to know what I've learned and to offer this layer. Certainly not the whole picture. I don't believe anyone has the whole picture. But pieces that I've gathered along the way that have informed my position and what I believe is what is occurring right now in 2020 and has been leading up to this precipice we find ourselves on. There's been many prophecies about this time. If you're familiar with any of the spiritual lineages, that this is a time of awakening, for better or for worse, and we are seeing structures that we believed were solid dissolve. We are seeing long-standing authorities coming into question, and I believe that our path through depends on the courage we have to see and to come back to our truth, to come back to our inner wisdom, and that this time, at this moment, we will each come to a point where we have to make a choice about what the world, about the world that you want to create, about the world that you're saying yes to. And so I offer this with humility and sobriety and with urgency. And I'm just going to offer you information. You can choose to do with it what you want. I will assure you that it has been with the greatest diligence that I have researched these facts and can offer you multiple sources of documentation and links to further information. And I'm happy to share all of that with you. And I encourage you, please, to look into any of this. And this will be a lengthy and heavy presentation. And I'm asking you to stay with me. And I'm asking you to hear me and to hold in mind that multiple truths can exist at once, and to allow our awareness to expand, to hold all of those different pieces and what it means for us as we evolve at this moment, who we are as people and who we are as a global community. Please listen through to the end, even if you have to take this in pieces. At least it's important. It feels so important for me to know that you know where I will stand and what I will fight for moving forward and what my perspective is, even if we don't end up sharing the same perspective. So these are just the pieces that I'm holding and that I want to share with you. I'm going to start with the United Nations. The United Nations plays a pivotal, if it plays the largest role right now in our current crises, our current moment of transition here. The U.S. is a charter member of the UN. I believe there's 197 nations part of this treaty, this group, united group of countries. The U.S. is one of 5 permanent members on the UN Security Council, and the U.S. is the largest national funder, the country that funds the UN more than any other country. There are private donors that we will talk about. The United Nations encompasses many, many, many different branches, and these are just a fraction of ones that you might see come up through this presentation. You can recognize the logo is very similar. They use the same motif, even if the name is slightly different. So the UN spending is used for, according to their website, for promoting human welfare through sustainable development and by providing quick response to disasters. Most of this humanitarian and development assistance happens in developing countries. So I have a little timeline I've put together going back to the early 2000s with some critical events that stand out to me as pivotal and significant steps to what is unfolding at this time. And I certainly don't stand alone as evidence or anything like that. They are just important pieces of information to understand where we're standing right now. And I have gone back and I have come up with what I feel, anyway, are interesting events of note. And the first one that I want to talk about is the Johannesburg Declaration of the UN, met in Johannesburg in 2002, developed this plan of implementation. This plan of implementation was based on earlier meetings and summits in this process of developing sustainable development goals to address poverty, inequality, and natural use of natural resources. So in September 2002, they came up with an agenda based on something called the Earth Charter, which was an earlier document in part written by Stephen Rockefeller. He was the chair of that drafting committee. And the Earth Charter was an international declaration of fundamental values and ideals for building a just, sustainable, and peaceful society in the 21st century through global interdependence and global partnership across all governments. So in September 2002, based on this Earth Charter, they came up with what is called Agenda 21, which was these goals to work towards by 2021. So we'll look at that document in a second. In 2002, the National Institutes of Health also filed a patent for coronavirus so that they could work towards a vaccine. That is not the only coronavirus patent. The Pirbright Institute in the UK holds patents for 11 different coronaviruses. In 2003, the Project BioShield launched, and we'll look at what that is. The PrEP Act in 2005 was enacted by Congress. And in 2006, DARPA, and that's the... it has a super long name. Let me look at it here. It's the Pentagon. I can't even remember the name. It's the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's like the mad scientist of U.S. defense. So they launched this program called Predicting Health and Disease, which is the first that I've known where they've kind of branched into health with their experiments and research. And then in 2007, Anthony Fauci, starts funding gain of function coronavirus studies. So that's where they experiment with trying to make the virus more powerful or more fatal, more lethal. And supposedly, this is according to Frank Collins, who was a high-level person at the NIH at that time. He says this was to define the fundamental nature of human pathogen interactions, enable the assessment of the pandemic potential of emerging infectious agents, and inform public health and preparedness efforts. So let's go to that Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development. Here it is. This document can be found online. I can send you a copy of it. It goes very in depth through all facets of society and earth resources and government and economy, with these goals, with this agenda to achieve by 2021. And I wonder how many people know about this document or even know that what these goals are. Those will come up throughout this presentation. But I want to mention Project BioShield. So this Project BioShield authorized $5.6 billion in funding over 10 years for the advanced development and purchase of priority medical countermeasures. This special reserve fund becomes available to the Secretary of Health and Human Services for procurement following interagency and White House approval. Project BioShield granted National Institutes of Health and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is headed by Anthony Fauci, authorizes them to expedite and simplify the solicitation, review, and award of grants and contracts for the development of critical medical countermeasures. This is in the aftermath of 9/11, where they were talking about anthrax and this threat of bioterrorism, biological attack on U.S. citizens. And then the PrEP Act followed that. And this is relevant because the PrEP Act was just reinstated this last February 2020. So in the PrEP Act means when a public health emergency is declared, this grants complete immunity for claims of loss and harm caused by any medical countermeasures, vaccines, drugs, products, therapeutics, interventions, technologies that are used against diseases or other threats of public health emergencies. We will talk about that further along the timeline, but it's significant and it's definitely worth a look over since it is in effect now through at least 2024. That is what the document says, and we'll look at that. So in 2010, we have a really interesting document that's published by the Rockefeller Foundation as part of a larger document called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. So the Rockefeller Foundation plays a key role in this process, in this picture of what's going on right now, and we'll talk about them. There's 3 specific foundations that are the biggest contributors to public health, to the United Nations, and the Rockefeller Foundation is key and has been for the last 100 years. So we're going to look at that document. And then DARPA creates the Biologics Technologies Office. So they're moving forward with these experiments with biologics and medical interventions. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services launches Healthy People 2020 initiative that outlines some goals, one of them specifically being creating a national database with everyone's health information that can be accessed by all providers. And the Global Vaccine Action Plan launches the Decade of Vaccines. This is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, UNICEF, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the NIH. So Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, this is a foundation that we will be seeing a lot of throughout this presentation. They pledged $10 billion from 2010 to 2020 for the research, development, and delivery of vaccines for the world's poorest countries, and Anthony Fauci is elected to the Leadership Council. So keep in mind that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gives a ton of money for vaccine research, development, implementation. They're also invested. The Bill and Melinda Gates Trust is invested in vaccines extensively. So it is not just philanthropy. I think Bill Gates' net worth went from 50 billion in 2010 to 100 billion by 2020, by this year, just from his investments in vaccines and medical research. So we're going to look at this document here, published by the Rockefeller Foundation, and I'm going to go to the PDF here. So scenarios for the future of technology and international development. And I'm going to skip to page 18 to this scenario called lockstep. So this is one possibility. There's 4 different scenarios in this document. Essentially trying to predict the way things could possibly go, like globally, and kind of playing out this scenario and exploring different options. So this one in particular is very interesting because it says a world of tighter top-down government control, more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. And the scenario begins in the past, as if you're in the past tense. So in 2012, the pandemic the world had been anticipating for years finally hit. Unlike 2009's H1N1, this new influenza strain, originating from wild geese, was extremely virulent and deadly. Even the most pandemic-prepared nations were quickly overwhelmed when the virus streaked around the world, infecting nearly 20% of the global population and killing 8 million in just 7 months. They go on to talk about that a few countries did better, China in particular. The Chinese government's quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens, as well as its instant and near hermetic sealing off of all borders, saved millions of lives, stopping the spread of the virus far earlier than in other countries, and enabling a swift post-pandemic recovery. Moving on to the next page, I've highlighted a couple interesting sections. China's government was not the only one that took extreme measures to protect its citizens from risk and exposure. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified. Further down, citizens willingly gave up some of their sovereignty and their privacy to more paternalistic states in exchange for greater safety and stability. Citizens were more tolerant and even eager for top-down direction and oversight, and national leaders had more latitude to impose order in the ways they saw fit. In developed countries, this heightened oversight took many forms. Biometric IDs for all citizens, for example. So, going back to revisit DARPA here. In 2006, DARPA announced its Predicting Health and Disease program, which sought to determine whether an individual will develop an infectious disease prior to the onset of symptoms. by identifying changes in the baseline state of human health through frequent surveillance, with a specific focus on viral upper respiratory infections. So they did this through research at Duke University, using analysis of blood samples to determine if someone is infected before they show symptoms. They created a national web-based influenza map available via smartphone. In 2014, they came up with a new technology, an implantable nano platform that would be placed subdermally under the skin and be able to sync to a smartphone app to give the use of immediate health insights. So some of that technology, obviously, we're seeing right now. And this was funded by the National Institutes of Health and Google Ventures. Some of these slides are really dense, so you can always, rewind and read it more thoroughly as I go through, but I've got a lot of them, so I'm going to move ahead. A quote from the Scientific American in 2016. Over the next 4 years, a new program in the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency plans to cultivate, among other things, a kind of cleanup crew for engineered genes deemed harmful or undesirable in an ecosystem. The initiative, called Safe Genes, comes at a time when so-called gene-drive systems, which override the standard rules of a gene inheritance and natural selection, are raising hopes among some scientists that the technology could alter or suppress populations of disease-carrying insects or other pests in as few as 20 generations. Here's an example of one of their projects called the FunVax, and you can read and you can download this document and you can view the Pentagon briefing in 2005. This was a vaccine that they developed as a biological weapon, flu vaccine that would be used in terrorist countries, according to them, that actually shuts down the part of the brain that they believe is associated with religious fundamentalism, as a way to prevent terrorist activity, suicide bombings. Yeah, so that's a little bit about who DARPA is and what they work on, to give you an idea. That's a real thing, FunVax. You can look it up. I can send it to you. So 2014 to 2018. In 2014, the NIH stops Fauci's gain-of-function experiments with the coronavirus. They state that it's a safety issue, a risk to public health. The virus would escape into the population, so they stop his experiments. He, in turn, skirts those safety laws in the U.S. by moving the experiments to Wuhan, to the Wuhan lab, the virology lab. And over the course of the next few years, he sends $3.7 million to keep those experiments going in Wuhan. In the meantime, between 2015 and 2019, legislation rolls out across all U.S. states to remove medical, religious, and personal belief vaccine exemptions and mandate the CDC schedule for every child attending public school. So that's 69 doses that are currently on the CDC schedule between birth and age 18. And with this removal of exemptions would mean the CDC can add more to that schedule at any time, and they're mandated without choice. And then we have the UN meets again, and they come up with Agenda 2030 and the global goals for sustainable development. And we will look at that in a moment. Excuse me. In 2015, Bill Gates interestingly meets with China's president to discuss how to boost Chinese economy and reduce poverty. They set 2020 goals. 2017, the Department of HHS publishes Control of Communicable Diseases, which is a document we'll look at in a moment. At an event at Georgetown University, January 2017, Fauci warns, he's quoted as saying, "There's no question there will be a challenge in infectious disease during this administration. There will be a surprise outbreak." In California, in 2017, the personal belief vaccine exemption for public school is eliminated. Bill Gates is elected member of the Chinese Academy of Science and given the highest honor, award, or whatever they give out. And then he also backs this company Earth Now with $1 billion to cover the Earth and 500 surveillance satellites. In 2018, the White House releases National Biodefense Strategy. And the National Biodefense Strategy is specifically talks about prepping against biological threats and supporting the CDC's enhanced surveillance and public health measures for basically for disease control, and routinely conducting and evaluating bio-incident response exercises. So those are the goals they outline in that. Also, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence is formed. And then the third thing is the United Nations Secretary General's Global Health Crises Task Force creates something called the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. So let's go back to this UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So let me find my notes here. Essentially, this is building on Agenda 21. We have Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, and eventually Agenda 2050. This can all be found on their website. Basically, if you scroll down this page, it's very long. It outlines 17 goals for building this just, sustainable, peaceful society in the 21st century. It's quite lengthy. It sounds great. It sounds like a utopia. It sounds like world peace and social and financial equity. If you go deeper into the documents, you will find that it literally outlines plans for managing all natural resources, creating an inventory of every plant, animal, mineral, human resource on Earth, and tracking fair, distribution of goods, efficient agriculture systems and management, and control of all trade and labor, of all banking, of all essentially surveillance and control of every living thing and every resource, the elimination of property ownership, the elimination of car ownership, the elimination of anything that you would own for yourself, and standardizing everything, universal health care, all of these things that are good goals in and of themselves. But when you dig deeper into it, it's totalitarianism is basically what it. I really encourage you to look at this, and I'm curious how many people know that this exists. I had not looked at this document until a couple of years ago, and how many people knew that the UN was meeting and creating these goals. We didn't vote for these goals. We all want sustainable development. These are great words that we agree on, and we want justice and we want equity. But I think the path to get there is subjective depending on who's creating this grander vision for our society. And it's vital that we're aware of it now, because it is rolling out now. It has been rolling out, and it is rolling out right now. So I can't tell you how important it is to look through this and familiarize yourself with it, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as we go through. I put the website up there. I can also send you the link. So HHS also releases this document, Control of Communicable Diseases, and they go back and look at the past several big pandemics like Ebola and Zika and influenza, and they devise a plan on how to deal with a global pandemic. And what's interesting about this, see if I can get closer in here. Just a couple of things that they mention here. This is in 2017. So this gives the public, the director that they mention in this document is the World Health Director. So World Health Organization is part of the UN, is part of United Nations. And what this document says is any communicable disease event as determined by the director, the World Health Organization director, with either documented or significant potential for regional, national, or international communicable disease spread that is highly likely to cause death or serious illness if not properly controlled. So this applies to any communicable disease event which the World Health Organization decides is likely to injure the population. So that this gives them supreme authority. If they say we are in danger, then they can, roll out essentially whatever countermeasure that they deem fit. And a couple of quotes I pulled out of here. The director may authorize the apprehension, medical examination, quarantine, isolation, and conditional release of any individual for the purpose of preventing the introduction, transmission, and spread of quarantinable communicable disease. If the individual is reasonably believed to be infected with a quarantinable communicable disease. So they don't even need evidence or a positive test to roll this out, and this applies to the United States. This is a HHS document. And then further down, it does mention electronic or internet-based monitoring. So electronic mail, SMS text, video or audio conference, webcam technologies, integrated voice response systems, entry of information into web-based form, wearable tracking technologies. So they are, it's interesting because they made such it's been such a big thing that we were not prepared for a pandemic, that the U.S. did a terrible job. And yet going back, we see that for years and years and years, they have been intricately preparing for pandemic, having all of these systems in place, so it seems. So now I want to talk about this Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, and I'm going to show you a slide that has a lot on it, and I'm going to walk through it a little bit, and hopefully it will make sense. So this was created in 2018 by the UN, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, who is highly influential at this moment in time. And I will tell you what and who it's comprised of and what they're responsible for. So the GPMB is the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank. But the World Bank and the World Health Organization are the United Nations. So it's just the United Nations. They have funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, which we will talk about, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Their governing board, Victor Zhao, who is the head of the National Academy of Medicine, Anthony Fauci, Chris Elias, who's basically the face of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and George Gao, who is the head of the Chinese CDC. They also receive funding from UNICEF, which is the United Nations, from Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, and Bloomberg Philanthropies. So I guess I'm gonna start here. I'm gonna start with Victor Zhao because he's a really interesting dude here. So the National Academy of Medicine, it was created by an act of Congress, but it's no longer a government agency. It's actually, it was reconstituted in 2015. That now the Institute of Medicine is now part of the National Academy of Medicine, and it's actually a 501c3. It's funded by private foundations. It's funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Wellcome Trust, and the World Economic Forum. Those are there's other funders. These are the largest ones. Victor Zhao, who was born, originally it was in China. He's in the U.S. now. His father owned a pharmaceutical company in China. He is a board member on the World Economic Forum, which he receives funding for. He's a board member of the IHME and advisory council to the London Imperial College. So the IHME and the London Imperial College were both responsible for the original modeling for COVID-19. He's the founder of McGill University for Population and Global Health and president of Research America, which is a medical research organization. Research America is funded by the Wellcome Trust and GlaxoSmithKline, Merck, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and Janssen. He's also on the advisory council to the Institutes of Health, NIH. He is quoted as saying in 2015 of the National Academy of Medicine, Dr. Victor Zhao said, "We don't only focus on medicine. It's a much broader mission. There are many reasons why we use this name for internal purposes." Dr. Victor Zhao sits on the executive board of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. Anthony Fauci also sits on the board. National Institutes of Health is funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Anthony Fauci also sits on the Leadership Council of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. National Institutes of Health is connected to the Wuhan Lab, Institute of Virology, sent $3.7 million there, which is connected to the Chinese Academy of Science and the Chinese CDC, which is directed by George Gao, who originally wrote the paper, the original paper in I believe it was December, a novel coronavirus when it was first identified in China. He's also on the governing board of the GPMB. And the Chinese CDC is part of this Sustainable Development Goals Transforming Our World 2030 agenda. The WHO, the World Health Organization's strategic priorities are rooted in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They are in purpose to that agenda, and all of their efforts are in support of those strategic priorities. So the World Health Organization receives funding from multiple nations, including the UK and usually the US, but at this moment, not the US. Without the US, the number one largest funder of the World Health Organization is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The USA was the first largest funder, and as they have dropped out, it's now the Gates Foundation. Also, it's funded by the World Bank, which is part of the UN, the United Nations, and the Wellcome Trust. I think that's about covers everything on this page. So the next one, we get a little bit deeper. So this was formed in 2018, right? The Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. So in 2018, they commissioned reports on global health from these agencies. From the International Federation of Red Cross, which is part of the United Nations. They commissioned reports from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which funds them, from the Wellcome Trust, which funds them, from Germany, from themselves, the World Health Organization, from Johns Hopkins, which shares the same funders as they do, Resolve to Save Lives, which essentially is, from what I can tell, is a front organization for the World Bank, the World Health Organization, Johns Hopkins, the CDC Foundation, and Bloomberg Philanthropies. They commissioned the World Bank, and they commissioned Dr. Tim Evans of McGill University of Population and Global Health, which is the same school that Dr. Victor Zhao founded. Tim Evans is also formerly worked for the World Bank, and he co-founded Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, with Bill Gates. He's also funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, represents Gavi, and the World Bank. So one of these reports that was done by the World Health Organization has some very interesting wording. So they were commissioned to write these, what are the global health challenges and how do we address them? The World Health Organization submitted a report looking at what the 2018-2019 Ebola outbreak in Congo tells us about our level of preparedness, and they used this phrase. The title of the report was From Never Again to the New Normal. Interesting phrasing. So I'm going to talk more about one other report that came out of that, but I'm going to go to 2019. So the beginning of 2019. In January 2019, the CARES Act is introduced to Congress. The actual CARES Act, the CARES Act that just passed, and I'm going to show that to you. I'm going to see if I can find it here. The CARES Act, yeah, here it is. So the CARES Act, which HR 748, we're going to look at these actions here, which passed on March 27th, 2020, was introduced actually in January 24th, 2019. It was passed in the House in July 2019. It passed in the Senate, then it sat there, and then it passed in the Senate on March 25th, and it was enacted and became law March 27th. So That's interesting. It's not uncommon, as we know, for bills to get introduced and kind of sit empty or with vague language and then get filled in at the last minute before they're passed through, kind of covertly. So that was new information to me. In January, the CARES Act was introduced. Also in January, we have a simulation event called Crimson Contagion. So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services ran this simulation of a novel influenza virus that begins in China and quickly spreads, first detected in Chicago in the US, and grows to pandemic proportion by human-to-human contact. This was a 4-day exercise, which they found that, their key findings that there was insufficient federal funding sources for severe influenza pandemic, that the current medical supply chain and production capacity could not meet the demand, that global manufacturing would be unable to meet the domestic demand for personal protective equipment and ancillary supplies. This was January 2019. Another thing that happened in January was this digital ID 2020, which was funded by the United Nations, was launched at the World Economic Forum. And in February, the president announced this executive order on artificial intelligence for the American people. Also, we have part of the Global Goals for Sustainable Development, Immunization Agenda 2030. With the support of countries and partners, the World Health Organization is leading the co-creation of a new global vision and strategy to address these challenges over the next decade, to be endorsed by the World Health Assembly. IA 2030 envisions a world where everyone, everywhere, at every age fully benefits from vaccines to improve health and well-being. In May, the NCAIS presents this document called the Chinese Tech Landscape Overview. This was obtained by a FOIA request, and we'll look at that document more in depth. And then in June, Microsoft files a patent for cryptocurrency with patent number 060606, cryptocurrency based on body activity data. Talked about Crimson Contagion. Let's talk about artificial intelligence for the American people, the executive order on AI. So this initiative implements a whole of government strategy in collaboration and engagement with the private sector, academia, the public, and like-minded international partners. It directs the federal government to pursue 5 pillars for advancing. 1, invest in AI research and development. 2, unleash AI resources. 3, remove barriers to AI innovation. 4, train an AI-ready workforce. And 5, promote an international environment that is supportive of American AI innovation and its responsible use. The U.S. is also actively leveraging AI to help the federal government work smarter in its own services and missions in trustworthy ways. A little bit more about this FOIA document, which was obtained by the Electronic Privacy Information Center. So remember, the NSCAI is the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, formed in 2018. It brings together 3 main groups: the intelligence community, the Pentagon, and Silicon Valley. Eric Schmidt is the chairman. He's the former CEO of Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google. And here's his quote: AI will bring back a 4th industrial revolution characterized by continuous technological development in areas like artificial intelligence, AI, big data, fifth generation telecommunications networking, 5G, nanotechnology and biotechnology, robotics and the Internet of Things, and quantum computing. So that's interesting, because at the same time we have the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, May 2019, presents this document which outlines it emphasizes where we are in relation to China and our technological, China's technological advancement over the U.S. So throughout the presentation, the NSCAI promotes the overhaul of the U.S. economy and way of life as necessary for allowing for the U.S. to ensure it holds a considerable technological advantage over China. So it deems losing this advantage as a national security issue. This concern about maintaining technological advantage can be seen in several other U.S. military documents and think tank reports. And it points out the need for explicit government support for the clearing of regulatory barriers with respect to U.S. privacy laws. Specifically in this document, they talk about China is already at this level of having cashless mobile payments, especially now, a Federal Reserve-backed digital dollar, autonomous vehicles, centralized ride shares, so getting rid of private ownership of vehicles, moving all shopping online, smart cities run with street surveillance, AI used for medical diagnosis, smart home devices, data integration across all platforms, facial recognition deployment, big data as the new market. Two quotes here from this document that I pulled out. Mass surveillance is one of the first and best customers for AI and a killer application for deep learning. And having streets carpeted with cameras is good infrastructure. So I think we've all probably seen videos, especially the last few months, of China, although it's hard to know what is accurate. It's pretty clear that the high level of surveillance and erosion of citizen privacy is pretty much the norm, and this document is essentially saying that's where we want to be if we want to compete with China. So in 2019, in the fall, we saw SB 276 passed in California, which is the removal of medical exemptions for all children attending public school. Many of you know, if we've had conversations about this, or you're aware of my activism work and my research in the realm of vaccines, we may have had conversations and we may not see eye to eye on this. I've spent the last 8 years looking into every facet of the vaccination program, from clinical trials to ingredients to the process of vaccine approval and manufacturing. So this bill that was passed in California, it removed the medical reason for denying any one of the 69 doses on the vaccine schedule, plus any more that the CDC can add at any time for your child to attend public school. So that includes if your child has autoimmune disease, if they've suffered prior vaccine reaction, if they've had seizure disorders after a vaccine, if they've had anaphylactic shock after a vaccine. It essentially denies the right of any doctor to write you a medical exemption to even skip one dose on that schedule of 69 doses, which is pretty wild, considering that that's a medical decision that should be between doctors and patients. And of course, there was quite an uprising from the community and from the population, as it was very much touted as irresponsible parents who are questioning the medical establishment and putting others at risk. So that was a significant bill that was passed in California. At the same time, in September, in October, we had a bunch of things happening at once. We had the U.S. Naval War College had a simulation of a respiratory pathogen. Their event was called Urban Outbreak. The simulation of a pathogen that was identified first in rodents and later spread person to person throughout the globe. And also in September, we had this compilation of all those world reports that were commissioned by the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, compiled into one document called A World at Risk. And we're going to look at that document a little bit more in depth. Also in September, we had a measles outbreak in Samoa and a polio outbreak in the Philippines following a polio vaccination campaign. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And as I said, I've followed this very closely. The United Nations has had a presence in these smaller, lower income territories for quite a while. And actually, if you go to, all of this is on their website. They have had, oops, I'm losing it. Samoa. They have plans in place for all of these small developing states and islands. They have a plan called the SIDS, Accelerated Modalities of Action Pathway for Samoa. And we've seen over and over in these smaller nations where an outbreak or health crisis creates this perfect opportunity for the UN to partner with local governments and come in and under the guise of public health and philanthropy to institute lockdowns. We saw in Samoa, lockdown, door-to-door vaccination campaign, the eradication of informed consent, closed borders, and extreme censorship, including jailing of doctors that are speaking out, specifically in Samoa, about the use of vitamin A and vitamin C that were actually saving children's lives, and silencing of anyone that's opposing the narrative. The stories that have come out of these smaller nations, and this is, we've watched this for decades, these stories emerging from families and from parents who end up on social media saying, my child was fine before they had the shot, before Gavi showed up, before the UN showed up and started these mass vaccination campaigns. And we know it's well documented that vaccines that are not approved for use in the US have continued to be used in third world and developing countries when they are deemed not safe in the United States. So those stories continue to get censored. Multiple stories came out of Samoa saying my child was healthy, and when they received vaccination, they became sick, or they became sick and died. Those stories have continued to be silenced and people deemed as uneducated, ignorant, superstitious, and of these bigger organizations that are clearly more educated and know better what's best for them. We see the polio outbreak in the Philippines, that it was a vaccine-derived polio strain that happened following a mass polio vaccination by the UN. You can look this up. I will link to this information. And they blamed it on, well, the population vaccination rates were too low, and that's why they're getting polio from the actual polio vaccine. Regardless of what that story is there, the UN has this perfect opportunity. They already have agreements with these smaller nations who need help, who don't have resources on their own, to come in and establish themselves, and they don't leave in these territories. And they, under the guise of helping these developing nations, which is subjective, right? They induce overhaul of economies and industries, partner with local government, control labor, and we see the loss of informed consent, and it's all for the greater good. Each one of these small nations has a plan on the United Nations website, Agenda 2030. In September 2019, the United Nations General Assembly meets in New York, and we'll talk about that in a second. So at the same time, and all of us in the medical freedom movement are watching this unfold and remembering seeing this measles outbreak in Samoa and going, this is a trial run, and feeling pretty certain that this was something they were testing out in another territory that would soon come to the US. And part of that was intuition, and part of that has been watching this unfold over years, how this plan rolls out over and over and over to countries, creating, well, maybe using a crisis, manufacturing or using an organic crisis to come in with this agenda, for better or for worse. In California, we saw AB 262, and we will look at that, this highly alarming bill that just passed through without any public awareness, granting complete jurisdiction to public health officers in the event of an outbreak or proximate health of a public threat of communicable disease. So all of these were sending off red flags for me and for others who are paying attention to this. And I'll look at that bill in a moment. And then we have Event 201, which is a global pandemic simulation exercise of a coronavirus outbreak. And this was as a result of this global health report, A World at Risk. And I'll show you who all participated in that event. In November, we have the CDC. I'll look close in here. The CDC has job postings for a public health advisor for the quarantine program. This is posted 11/15/2019. I don't know if you can see the locations there. They're looking for public health advisors for quarantine programs in Dallas, Texas, El Paso, Houston, Washington, Alaska, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Florida, Hawaii, Chicago, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on and on and on. So that's strange. We didn't have a public health announcement of a global health crisis until January for the coronavirus in China. Two other things that happened in December. MIT announces the development of a new subdermal medical storage technology delivered by vaccine. December 31st, Wuhan Municipal Health Commission announces the first cluster of pneumonia cases in China. So I'm going to look a little bit deeper into this document, A World at Risk, the Annual Report on Global Preparedness for Health Emergencies. So just to remind you, this is funded by the United Nations, the World Bank, which is part of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, which is part of the United Nations, the NIH, and all of these organizations are funded by the Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Johns Hopkins University, which is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and Bill and Melinda Gates. September 19th, the GPMB outlined 7 urgent actions for global health by September 2020. I'm going to take a look at that document here, if I can find it. A World at Risk. Here it is. I'm just going to go through quickly these 7 urgent outcomes. Scrolling through, executive summary. 7 urgent actions to prepare the world for health emergencies. Heads of governments must commit and invest. All countries, here's the progress indicator by September 2020. All countries that have completed an assessment of their capacities by the 1st of July 2019 developed a national action plan for health security. Countries and regional organizations must lead by example. I'm going to skip to this one. All countries must build strong systems. We need a whole of government and whole of society approach and routinely conduct multi-sectoral simulation exercises to establish and maintain effective preparedness. Progress indicators. The WHO, the World Bank, and partners. So they are commissioning themselves to do this work of preparedness. This is all really interesting considering the emphasis on how unprepared we were for this pandemic, this coronavirus outbreak. This is a lot of preparation. Here we have countries, donors, and multilateral institutions must be prepared for the worst. I'm going to read this here. A rapidly spreading pandemic due to a lethal respiratory pathogen, whether naturally emergent or accidentally or deliberately released, poses additional preparedness requirements. Donors and multilateral institutions must ensure adequate investment in developing innovative vaccines and therapeutics, surge manufacturing capacity, broad-spectrum antivirals, and appropriate non-pharmaceutical interventions. All countries must develop a system for immediately sharing genome sequences of any new pathogen for public health purposes, along with the means to share medical countermeasures across countries. One of the progress indicators by September 2020. A universal influenza vaccine, broad-spectrum antivirals, targeted therapeutics. The WHO and its member states develop options for standard procedures and timelines for sharing of sequenced data, specimens, and medical countermeasures. Financing institutions must link preparedness with financial risk planning. Here they identify again the International Monitoring Fund, which I've now realized is also part of the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, International Development Association, which is part of the UN, the Global Fund, and Gavi. Gavi is Bill Gates and the Rockefeller Foundation. Let's see. Here we have development assistance. Funders must create incentives and increase funding for preparedness. I really encourage anyone who's interested to look through and read these goals more thoroughly. It's really fascinating. And then here we have the United Nations must strengthen coordination mechanisms in different country, health, and humanitarian emergency contexts by ensuring clear United Nations system-wide roles and responsibilities, rapidly resetting preparedness and response strategies during health emergencies, enhancing United Nations system leadership for preparedness, including, I think that's meant to be thorough, routine simulation exercises. Through routine simulation exercises. One of the progress indicators here, the United Nations, including WHO, conducts at least 2 system-wide training and simulation exercises, including one for covering the deliberate release of a lethal respiratory pathogen. Whew. Okay, so that's that document, September 2019. The same month, we have the UN General Assembly meeting in New York, and they launch the Sustainable Development Goals Acceleration Actions. This is taken from their website about the General Assembly. On the 24th and 25th of September, heads of state and government gathered at the United Nations headquarters in New York to follow up and comprehensively review progress in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The SDG Summit resulted in the adoption of the political declaration. I really encourage everyone to take a look at this. And quoted from this declaration, gearing up for a decade of action and delivery for sustainable development. World leaders called for a decade of action to deliver the SDGs by 2030 and announced actions they are taking to advance the agenda. This was endorsed on the 15th of October with more than 100 accelerated actions announced. What their idea of sustainable development is may differ from what your idea for sustainable development is. And at the very least, we should all be familiar with what they've decided is in the best interest of the mass population and this implementation on a global scale. We're talking about complete inventory and control of every plant, mineral, human being, resource, and facet of society is pretty impressive. So we have, you can find this on their website, in partnership with DESA, Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Here is their resolution, adopted the 15th October 19. The SDGs Turning Promises into Reality, from their website. The 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals are our collective response to building a fair globalization. So when people talk about one world government, one world order, these words that have been associated with conspiracy theories, I assure you, none of this is theoretical and none of this is secret. It's quite accessible for anyone to read. And this is something you may support and believe this is the direction we should go in, but at the very least, we should be familiar that it's happening. It's been in the planning stages for more than 20 years. It's been in implementation stages for the past 20 years, and it is based on a world vision from these elite people, including the Rockefellers and plenty more I'm sure I don't know the names of, I'm not aware of, that are even beyond that are making decisions in partnership with all nations, or 197 nations of the world, that is currently rolling out without most of us being aware. And this current crisis, I will not go as far as to say where it came from or what I think the virus is. I'm pointing out that it's very convenient, more than convenient, that everything that's happening right now is a prime opportunity for all of these goals to roll out, especially the ones that would meet public resistance, such as loss of privacy and surveillance measures. And with the economic collapse, we are going to need a plan to come in and reestablish economic stability. I want to talk a little bit about AB 262. This is when I really started to get anxious. I was prepared for shit to hit the fan in 2020. I think a lot of us have been. But this AB 262, the wording, and I was talking about this to people, I was posting about this in social media, and all the way up until continuing, people treat you like you're overreacting and that you're paranoid. But let's look at the wording in this document here. So it's a very short bill and has very broad language. It says, during an outbreak of a communicable disease or upon the imminent and proximate threat of a communicable disease outbreak or epidemic that threatens the public health, the public health officer can take any action the local health officer deems necessary to control the spread of the communicable disease. The public health officer of each county has supreme jurisdiction over the governor, over the supervisor, over the president to make these calls as they see fit as it pertains to protecting public health within that community. If you go further into the document and you look into the breakdown of each of these, of this outline, I've highlighted this portion here. A state public health officer as the director of the DHP, which is Department of Public Health, so this is statewide, has this broad authority to detect, monitor, and prevent the spread of communicable disease, including B, adopt and enforce regulations requiring strict or modified isolation or quarantine for any of the contagious, infectious, or communicable diseases, if, in the opinion of the DPH, the action is necessary for the protection of public health, which, if it is, of course we should isolate and quarantine those who are sick and affecting others, if it truly is a threat to public health. This leaves quite a large margin of interpretation. And considering that all of these orders are coming down from the same entity, the UN, the World Health Organization, which is disseminating this information out to nationwide and local and regional public health authorities, it's just something to look at a little bit closely. So C, they also can take measures as are necessary to ascertain the nature of the disease and prevent its spread. It permits them, to that end, to take possession or control of the body of any living person or the corpse of any deceased person. D, quarantine, isolate, inspect, and disinfect persons, animals, houses, rooms, and other property, places, cities, or localities whenever, in its judgment, the action is necessary to protect or preserve the public health. Is this California or is this communist China? They can also destroy such objects as bedding, carpets, household goods, furnishing, materials, clothing, or animals when ordinary means of disinfection are considered unsafe or when the property, in its judgment, is an imminent menace to public health. When this went through, I started to get worried. Alarm bells were going off for a lot of us that were paying attention, because at that time there was no, and had been no, imminent threat of outbreak. They used the hepatitis outbreak that happened in San Diego as kind of an impetus to create these stronger public health bills as a protection mechanism. And all of this preparation can be looked at as, yes, of course, we're trying to set up structures to protect public health in the event of an outbreak. All of that makes sense. It's just when you look at all of these pieces together that it starts to feel uneasy. When this bill passed, I thought for certain there would be an outbreak in 2020. I didn't realize it would happen exactly as it's happening, but we started preparing. We started preparing last summer for what might go down in 2020, especially after Event 201, which you may have heard about. The GPMB, which is the United Nations and World Health Organization, had this event, which had multiple officers and people from different agencies around the globe. It was funded by Johns Hopkins, the Rockefeller Foundation, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Chinese CDC, George Gao, the director was there, Tim Evans, we see him once again, McGill University, former World Bank, co-founder of Gavi. So you can find this footage on YouTube. If you look on YouTube, you can find plenty of footage from this event. I've linked a couple of things here, and I'm going to play you this clip from Tim Evans of McGill University. Remember that is the university founded by Victor Zhao, the director or the chairman of the Academy of Medicine, and McGill University of Population and Global Health is concerned with addressing the issue of overpopulation, of poverty, and moving forward how we sustain the growing population and limited resources on our planet. So this is what he has to say at Event 201.
There should be a time-bound plan with very clear targets with respect to what would constitute a new level of global preparedness. And we should look at what's required to get that financed, but that it has some real accountability to agents that lie behind or are advocating for a stronger global governance.
Stronger global governance. That's Tim Evans.